How the Jews Betrayed Mankind. Volume 1, The Sumerian Swindle. Second edition by G_D, continuing with Chapter 6. 2334 BC, Sargon gains control of Sumeria. The city of Kish has a history that goes back to pre-literate times. Because it was situated away from the more densely populated regions of Sumeria, it was settled by the Semites from the Syrian desert who entered that less inhabited part of Mesopotamia from the north and west around 2900 BC, several hundred years after the Sumerians had arrived in the region. Like all other people who settled in the Fertile Crescent, they absorbed the older Sumerian culture and made it their own. They wrote their Semitic language with Sumerian cuneiform characters, and they worshipped the same gods and followed the same cultural patterns that had always been here. Because the Semitic Amorites who settled this region built their culture based upon what the Sumerians had already created, nearly everything was Sumerian in origin, but with embellishments of a Semitic style. While Sumeria continued to be a thriving and prosperous culture to the south, the Semites in the area of Babylon and Kish built up their own independent strength and power. After Uma's governor, Lugal-Zaggesi, overthrew Urukagina of Uruk and killed King Ur-Zababa of Kish, Ur-Zababa's chief minister and cup-bearer took over the kingship of Kish. The cup-bearer's name was Sharum-Kin, Sharrum-Kin, known to us as Sargon. Sargon the Great, 2334 to 2279 BC, was the first of the ancient personages who was given a divine beginning which, more than 1,000 years later, the Jews plagiarized for their own myths about Moses. According to one tradition, Sargon's father was unknown, which meant that he was of humble birth. One story, as found in The Legend of Sargon, written around 2300 BC, gives him a peasant origin. Quote, Sargon, the mighty king of Agade, am I. My mother was a lowly, my father I knew not. The brothers of my father loved the mountain. My city is Azupiranu, which is situated on the bank of the Euphrates. My lowly mother conceived me. In secret she brought me forth. She placed me in a basket of reeds. She closed my entrance with bitumen. She cast me upon the river, which did not overflow me. The river carried me. It brought me to Aki, the irrigator. Aki, the irrigator, in the goodness of his heart, lifted me up. Aki, the irrigator, as his own son, brought me up. Aki, the irrigator, as his gardener, appointed me. When I was a gardener, the goddess Ishtar loved me, and for 4 years I ruled the kingdom. End quote. Other legends of Sargon claimed that he was the illegitimate son of a priestess of Kish. Since the king was the chief representative of God, the priests and scribes created the necessary divine link in the legend of Sargon. The legend told that Sargon was the son of a high priestess who bore him secretly because she was prohibited from having sexual relations with a man. A high priestess was often of royal lineage and often the consort of a god. Although his origins are uncertain, the later histories agree that Sargon served as the king's cupbearer. The office of cupbearer to the king was an important political station in the hierarchy of ancient Near Eastern politics. He who stood by the king and offered him a cup of wine was also an official taster to ensure that the wine had not been poisoned. In addition, he would act as a casual bodyguard so that others could not approach the king too closely. Such a person would be well acquainted with the entire kitchen staff and the logistics of supplies for the palace. Also, being present during all official banquets, ceremonies, and receptions of foreign dignitaries, the cupbearer of the king was privy to the most intimate secrets of kingly office. He could overhear or be invited to participate in discussions and entertainments. Such a trusted person would be asked for his advice by the king. A cupbearer also met the various merchants who visited the palace. Such an officer of the court became educated in the far regions of the surrounding countries and gained an understanding of the strengths and weaknesses of each. The wily merchants were always alert for those who could be of use to them, weighing their characters and ambitions as carefully as weighing specks of gold. Luxury items were important for maintaining the prestige of the royal palaces and the temples. Because of the expense and risk involved in obtaining these rare materials, their acquisition remained the business of kings and queens, powerful governors, and temple priests. All of them would deal personally with the merchants and moneylenders. Moneylending and import-export were usually amalgamated within the same business families of Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders. These merchant moneylender families became intimately familiar with many kings and administrators over many generations. Just as they do today, these old scoundrels passed this political and personal information along to their sons so that the database of information about the kings and their families increased and was perpetuated over generations of swindlers, while what the kings knew of the moneylenders remained relatively constant. Over the centuries, both raw materials and finished products were imported to Mesopotamia from every direction, such as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, reaching both Mesopotamia and Egypt through a complicated network of overland routes. These routes were complicated because over the millennia, the various game trails and footpaths through the mountains and deserts were expanded both to serve outlying villages and to enable caravans to outmaneuver roving tribes of bandits. Flooding rivers, draft through the deserts, drought through the deserts, and mountain landslides all contributed to rerouting even the oldest trails through the wilderness. Commodities arrived by sea from East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. Under such conditions, trade could only occur through carefully organized and well-funded organizations, so an individual merchant had little chance of success against the odds of nature or in competition with the monopolistic trade guilds. Although the palaces, temples, and kings were the main customers for luxury goods, all of these goods without exception passed through the hands of the merchants and moneylenders who each and every one were members of the same trade guilds. There were no independent businessmen in those days who were not guild members. Thus, the Tamkaram merchant moneylenders knew as a corporate entity what the private treasurers of the palace and temples were, as well as the character and depth of greed of both royalty and priests. This royal inventory was collected through the generations of merchants within their extended family groups and quietly discussed during guild meetings. True, the kings knew their own people and something about the surrounding cities and territories, but it was the merchants and moneylenders who knew the surrounding territories better than the kings. This scheming group of merchants made it their business to know everybody else's business and to profit thereby. Through their guilds and marriage connections, the business families controlled information and spy networks that were larger than that of any individual kingdom. By the time of Sargon, these secret and subterranean guilds of moneylenders began to flex their power of the purse to control the destiny of peoples. Secret fraud number 7 of the Sumerian Swindle gave them an important advantage. Monopoly gives wealth and power, but monopoly of money gives the greatest wealth and power. With their skills in accounting and numbers, the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, and their scribes could estimate to precise degrees the relative strengths of the various nations and the wealth of their kings. In an age where even the kings were illiterate and dependent upon the scribes for writing and calculating, the scribes became important sources of information and targets of corruption. Thus, what the merchants actually controlled was not just wealth, but also information about resources. Besides inventories of the palace treasuries, grain field areas gave them close estimates of grain harvests, valuable knowledge when weighing the strengths and weaknesses of a kingdom. All of this information was known by the scribes. Subverting and bribing the scribes for such data gave the Tamkaram guilds military intelligence about the capabilities of every country. But they could only control the destiny of nations if they worked secretly and kept their best swindles to themselves. To work secretly meant that only verbal orders and agreements could be made between trusted sons and guild members. Even though the vast majority of the people were illiterate, that did not prevent them from hiring a scribe to read or write their letters and contracts. By using cylinder seals and stamps impressed upon wet clay, even the illiterate could mark their possessions and seal their packages. Figure 7. With such a unique stamp, everybody could authenticate a legal document. When pressed into the wet clay, both these impressions and the cuneiform writing could not be altered once the clay had hardened. Seals could be rolled on lumps of clay to seal doorways, pottery jars, and packages. Seals could be carved on stone, bone, metal, or shell. For sale, within the budget of every man, among the awalim, the haves. The use of cylinder seals continued throughout Mesopotamian history. It says, reading and writing was not a common skill of most people in the ancient Near East. Professional scribes wrote the letters and contracts that their illiterate clients could not read, but everybody could sign his name with a cylinder seal or a stamp. Although the clay tablets and cylinder seals are superior even to modern paper and computer disks in terms of permanence and longevity, they did not have any privacy. Ciphers and secret codes had been used for centuries. The secret meaning of words was a standard part of the scribes' schooling. This need for secrecy brought about a new invention. Around the time of Sargon, envelopes were invented. These were flattened sheets of clay modeled around the clay tablets. The clay envelopes protected the contents from damage and fraud by safeguarding against someone moistening the clay and changing the writing. They provided a kind of notary seal, or a poor man's copyright, that protected the legitimacy of the contents. Sometimes the text was repeated on the envelope so you could read what was sealed inside. In the case of a dispute, the envelope would be opened and the contents examined and compared. Some envelopes opened in modern times have been found with the information written on them different from that of the tablets inside. So, fraud was not unknown. Lugal-Zaggisi had provided the merchants and moneylenders the means of regaining their property by overthrowing Uruk-Kagina, the reformer king of Lagash. But greed is a demon that is never satisfied, just as a fire is never satisfied by adding more fuel. The huge quantities of gold and silver that had been looted from the temples of Lagash gave the moneylenders new ideas for acquiring even more. This vast new source of bullion flowed into their businesses from the soldiers and laborers who had looted this wealth during Lugal-Zaggisi's victories. For the sacking of temples as direct participants, the moneylenders could plead innocence before the gods. It was through their business that they gained all of this loot. Silver and gold made available to the people as war booty meant that the people had more silver to buy the grain, the garments, the beer, the prostitutes, the slaves, and the luxury items that were the stock in trade of the merchants and moneylenders. War was very profitable to the winners. Profit meant power, and the treasonous class desired ever more wealth and power without themselves being impious or subject to being cursed by the gods. The Tamkarim, merchant moneylenders, had learned how to inveigle the poor into doing all of the stealing. Secret fraud number 20 is champion the minority in order to dispossess the majority of their wealth and power, then swindle the minority out of that wealth and power. Using this method, it didn't matter whether the Tamkarim, merchant moneylenders themselves, took possession of a temple's wealth or not. They could avoid the curses of the gods by letting the poor soldiers loot the temples, and then they could swindle the loot away from the soldiers with the Sumerian swindle. Taking the gold from the gods was a curse, but the gold was not cursed. Only the looters who took it were cursed. The merchants who took the gold from the looters were innocent. Oy, so innocent. However rich the Tamkarim, merchant moneylenders were, only among the kings and the priests were power and prestige found. Mere merchants and moneylenders were forever spat upon and hated by the people whom they had swindled. Only among themselves did they have prestige, a prestige based upon who among them was the richest. According to secret fraud number 9 of the Sumerian swindle, among the moneylenders, bankers, and merchants, only the most ruthless and greedy moneylenders survive. Only the most corrupt bankers triumph. Thus, the most ruthless and greedy of the Tamkarim, merchant moneylenders, were also the most prestigious leaders among them. In every gang, it is the most criminal who is the boss of the gangsters. For the greedy moneylenders of Kish, Lugal-Zaggisi had been a king for too long. His 24-year reign had allowed him to assemble all of the cities of Sumeria into one single empire. This was the first time in over 1,000 years that all of Sumeria had been united. But Lugal-Zaggisi was a Sumerian, and he was satisfied with being the king of Sumeria. He had been financed by the moneylenders of Sumeria to destroy Uruk-Kagina of Lagash and to eliminate the Semitic king of Kish before turning south and conquering all of Sumeria. He was happy with his victories and was not ambitious for further conquests. But the merchant moneylenders of Kish had lost their treasuries to him. They were Semitic Amorites, not Sumerians. Although they had absorbed the Sumerian culture, they were of a different race and temperament and language. As merchants and traders, they were adept at seeing the strengths and weaknesses in men and of taking advantage of their weaknesses while undermining their strengths. They knew of the great wealth their guild brothers in Sumeria had gained through war. They had lost much to them. They wanted some of those profits for themselves, and they wanted their treasures returned to them. The moneylenders found their champion in the cupbearer of the former king of Kish. Like most court officials, Sharam Kin had the manners, charisma, and air of authority to make a natural leader. He knew the subtle ways of politics and court intrigue. He had the drive toward avenging his former master's death at the hands of Lugal-Zaggisi. and with the assurance from the moneylenders for their unlimited financial support in buying weapons and paying for an army, he had the means of attacking Lugal-Zagessi at Uruk. What's more, he had the information from his Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, informers, and merchant spies. Sargon was apprised of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the many cities under Lugal-Zagessi's rule. He knew how many men they had, how rich was their treasuries, how full was their granaries, how strong were the walls of the cities, and which of the numerous kings would be willing to fight against him, and which would acquiesce to his rule in exchange for liberality. All of this information was complements of the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders. Vital information indeed, information that could only have been supplied by the Tamkaram, who did business with all of those cities. In addition, from the earliest days in pre-literate times, none of the city-states of Mesopotamia had kept standing armies. Their armies consisted of the ordinary citizens, farmers, fishermen, brickmakers, court officials, and city governors, assembling whenever there was a threat. Mankind had not reached such huge numbers in population that necessitated standing armies as protection against other armies in other countries. When threats of war between cities seemed imminent, it was simply a matter of sending runners to outlying villages and criers throughout the cities to assemble enough farmers and fighters to go to battle. While supplies were drawn in and city gates were shut, the populace secured themselves behind their city walls of mud bricks. Although this was how it had always been, the ancient Sumerian system was about to change. Sargon kept secret his war preparations. With sufficient financing and access to the Tamkaram, trade routes, he did not need to do business with the Sumerian cities in the south for his supplies, but could buy directly from the Semitic cities far to the north and west, away from the knowledge of Lugal-Zagessi. Directly to the west of him on the Euphrates was the city of Mari, which was a major manufacturer of copper and bronze implements and weapons. After all, this was still the Bronze Age, and such weapons could be bought through the Tamkaram, monopolies at Mari, without raising suspicions. Once his army was armed and trained, Sargon struck swiftly, attacking Uruk and dragging away Lugal-Zagessi like a dog in a neck stock to be tied to the gates of Nippur. While Lugal-Zagessi had fought against each of the Sumerian city-states in order to defeat them, Sargon used politics to win most of his victories. First, he demonstrated his military might by defeating Lugal-Zagessi at Uruk. He then turned to the other cities of Sumeria. To those kings who refused to acquiesce to his rule, he fought against and defeated them in battle. But those kings who agreed to accept his rule, he granted them their kingship intact and their cities as their own, as long as they paid tribute and maintained Sargon's own relatives and trusted friends as resident advisors in the palace. Sargon the Great was a brilliant military leader as well as an innovative administrator. Sargon was the first king to unite all of Mesopotamia, both the north, Akkad, and the south, Sumer, under one ruler. His Akkadian empire became a prototype for later kings. Sargon's policy was to destroy the walls of cities within his empire, thus depriving potential rebels of strongholds. He also took members of local ruling families to his capital as hostages. If the city governors were willing to shift their allegiance, Sargon kept the old administration in office. Otherwise, he filled governorships with his own citizens and appointed only Semites to high administrative positions. In this way, he encouraged the collapse of the old city-state system and moved towards centralized government, backed by reliable garrisons. Sargon installed military garrisons at key positions to manage his vast empire and to ensure the uninterrupted flow of tribute, and he was the first king to have a standing army. In the scribal records, 34 battles are recorded with the victorious Sargon gaining control not only of Akkad, but of all Sumeria on his way to the Persian Gulf, where he washed his weapons in the sea in a ritual commemoration of his victories. On the way back, he completed his conquest of southern Sumeria. Sargon then turned west and north, traveling along the trade routes of the Euphrates toward the Mediterranean, where he conquered the lands of Mari, Yarmuti, and Ebla, up to the Cedar Forest, Amanus Mountains, and the Silver Mountain, Taurus Mountains. Mention of cedar and silver reveals clearly the motivation for this distant campaign. Gaining control of the silver and the building materials meant to both wealth and power for himself and his economic backers of the treasonous class. Returning to Kish, he then turned east to conquer Elam and neighboring Barakshi, Barakhshi. Later legend adds still further victories, taking him across the sea as far as Anaku, the Tin Country, location uncertain, and Kaptara, Old Testament Kaftar, or Crete. Caftor, or Crete. His victory over two major commercial centers, Mary on the middle Euphrates and Ebla in the northern Syria, were important because of their strategic position on trade routes. Ebla was the center of metal trade in the 3rd millennium BC. In these decisions can be seen the work of Sargon's advisors. Wealth acquisition and trade were paramount. The Silver Mountain mines provided Sargon with the wealth to increase state power and to buy influence, but most importantly, to balance the false accounting books of the Tamkaram. Without an injection of free silver, the debts of the king and the people could never be repaid under the cheating Sumerian swindle. By this date in history, silver had become the ultimate commodity with which all other commodities could be bought. This shiny metal that was too soft for anything other than making trinkets was useful in its rarity as a type of commodity money. Those who owned the sources of this material could dig it out of the ground at low production costs using war slaves and debt slaves. The silver that was obtained for free as war booty or cheaply from slave labor mines actually had a higher buying power than silver obtained through taxes. Taxes only recycled existing silver and left the problem of the phantom and fraudulent moneylenders' interest unpayable. However, newly mined silver increased the existing total by digging it out of the ground to pay off the phantom interest that the Sumerian swindle had created out of thin air. Theft was the only way for the moneylenders to balance their books because, in reality, interest on a loan creates more debt than there is money in existence to repay it. Sargon's power was greatly increased by the monopoly over the silver mines that helped to finance his empire, and the wealth of the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, was increased as the people used their war booty to give to the moneylenders as payments for the fraudulent interest on a loan. To judge from the much later legends and chronicles, Sargon's conquests continued to range far and wide. He may even have sent his armies to Egypt, Ethiopia, and India. To control so vast an empire, he stationed military garrisons at various key outposts. Large armies require large taxes and income in the form of tribute. In Sumeria itself, where rebellion was chronic, he appointed fellow Semites to the higher administrative posts and garrisoned the cities with all Akkadian troops. For himself and his huge court of officials and soldiers, the archives boast that 5,400 men ate bread daily before him. He built a resplendent capital city of Agade, not far from Kish, though its location is still unknown. In a brief span of time, Agade became the most prosperous and magnificent of the cities of the ancient world. Gifts and tribute were brought to it from the four corners of Sargon's realm. At its quays, ships docked from far-off Dilmun, Bahrain, Magan, Oman, and Melukuka, the Indus Valley. Most of Agade's citizens were no doubt Semites related to Sargon by ties of blood and language, and it is from the name Agade, or rather from its biblical counterpart, Akkad, Genesis 10:10, that the word Akkadian has come to designate today the Mesopotamian Semites in general. Notice should be taken of the importance of the wharves and quays of Sumerian cities. Water transportation was naturally the most efficient way to move men and materials on the two rivers and through the network of interlinking canals and irrigation channels. Of course, international merchant ships from the Persian Gulf moved upriver and docked at the wharves, so their commercial value was carefully monitored. Because they were a stop for foreign sailors and traders, the wharves also had to function not only as a as a place of commerce, but as a guarded enclave to prevent foreign spies and troublesome sailors from infiltrating into the city proper. Aside from the walled city with its temples and royal palaces and the suburbs outside of the walls, the average Sumerian city also included a special area of wharves. The wharf section functioned not only as a docking facility for ships, but also as a center of commercial activity. The wharf had administrative independence and separate legal status for the citizens transacting business there. Foreign traders had stores there, and their needs were met by the sabbatum, alewife moneylender, of the wharf. These women tavern keepers provided the sailors with everything that a sailor would want. So the problems associated with controlling foreign sailors and sea captains were minimized by keeping them restricted to the wharf area of the cities. And on the quays and wharves, the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, could keep a close eye on their cargoes and bargain for newly arrived goods. The close cooperation between Sargon and the Tamkaram can be seen throughout his career. Under his rule, international trade flourished between the Mediterranean coast and the Persian Gulf. Trade goods from as far away as India could be carried into regions of the Mediterranean basin. Even when a local king as far away as Purush Khanda in Asia Minor was oppressing a Mesopotamian merchant colony, Sargon sent a military expedition to protect it. Rich inducements were offered to Sargon by the merchants, and he marched with great difficulty to Purush Khanda, where his presence alone brought about a settlement of the merchants' grievances. Sargon the Great appreciated the power of the moneylenders and merchants because they had helped him to win his empire, and he understood the importance of trade to the general well-being of his administration. Military coercion increased the flow of goods to the imperial center from areas firmly under his control, but the private enterprise of the merchants not under Sargon's rule also engaged in limited trade throughout his empire. For example, Aratta, Aratta, a city-state most probably in northwestern Iran near the Caspian Sea, is described in Sumerian myths and epics as the rival of Uruk. Aratta was known for its stone, metals, craftsmen, and artisans, and of course, Magan and Maluka were written about in texts from the time of Sargon the Great to the middle of the first millennium BC. Sargon recorded that boats from Magan, Oman, and Maluka, Indus Valley, and Dilmun, Bahrain, dropped anchor in his capital, Agade. Maluka was described as the place of black men, and its people as men of the Black Land, or Black Malukites. The Black Land was described in myths, epics, and economic documents as a prosperous, populous country full of trees, reeds, bulls, birds, various metals, and carnelian. There were always foreigners in Mesopotamian cities. The Sumerians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians knew about the geography, economy, political organization, religious beliefs, and customs of foreign countries and their peoples. From archaeological and literary evidence, the world that the Mesopotamians knew about extended north into Anatolia, the Caucasus and westerly parts of Central Asia, to the south into Arabia, to the east into India, and to the west to the Mediterranean Sea, Cyprus, Crete, and Egypt. Under Sargon the Great, business prospered and great wealth flowed all across the empire, and all of this wealth passed through the hands of the moneylenders and merchants. Merely by being the middlemen in any transaction, wealth is siphoned by the Tamkarim, merchant moneylenders, in handling fees and commissions in addition to profits from sales, and so developed secret fraud number 18 of the Sumerian Swindle. When the source of goods is distant from the customers, profits are increased both by import and export. The new supplies of silver, the tribute from conquered territories, and taxes gave Sargon the spending power to not only enrich the merchants through an increase in trade and luxury goods, but to buy off the priests and laity. Rebuilding temples were not just acts of piety, but were public works where the wealth of the empire could be used to employ the people and to increase political support from the temple priests. The new wealth of the laborers gave the merchants bigger profits also. This new system of centralized government with its bureaucracy of administrators set standards for all future empires in the Near East. One of Sargon's innovations was the establishment of the office of High Priestess to the moon god at as a royal sinecure, apparently in a deliberate move to ally his Akkadian administration to the loyalty of the 2,500-year-old and once powerful Sumerian centers. His daughter, Enheduanna, was the first holder of this celebrated post. For the next 500 years, until the end of the reign of Rim-Sin of Larsa, the appointment was a royal prerogative which was exercised through numerous dynastic changes. This appointment of the priestess provided Sumeria a unifying link even in periods of apparent disunity. As well as being the first, Enheduanna was the most distinguished in this long line of priestesses. There survive a number of hymns that she herself, a Semitic Akkadian, is said to have composed, in excellent Sumerian. Since the ancients did not usually sign their names to their literary creations, we know Enheduanna as history's first known literary figure. Even her portrait has survived. But there was another reason that has been overlooked by the archaeologists as to why Sargon put his daughter into the high office of the moon god at Ur. As the king of Akkad and Sumeria, he could have installed his daughter in any temple that he chose. Why not make her priestess in the greatest temple of the highest god in all of Sumeria, the god of Enlil, in the city of Nippur? Why make her priestess of the moon god at Ur? The moon god was the tutelary deity of the moneylenders of Sumeria, and the city of Ur was the main depot of all international trade from the Persian Gulf. Ur is where the sea-going ships offloaded their cargo onto shallow draft river-going boats. Because the Semitic moneylenders of Akkad had helped Sargon to take power, it was important in his control of Sumeria to also control the moon god's temple in Ur. In this way, Sargon had both the temple that the Sumerian moneylenders prayed in, as well as the main terminal city of the international Persian Gulf trade firmly under the control of both himself and his Semitic merchants and moneylenders of Akkad. But Sargon had considerable difficulty in controlling his vast empire. Even during his reign and among the cities of Babylonia, there were never-ending rebellions. The Sargon Chronicle tells us that, in his old age, all the countries revolted against him, and they besieged him in Agade. Although Sargon crushed these insurrections, his sons and grandsons did not inherit a peaceful empire. Sargon's empire lasted just over a century, 2334 to 2150 BC. Its final collapse was prompted by the invasion of a people from the Zagros Mountains who disrupted trade and ruined the irrigation system. Although Sargon could defend his empire during his lifetime, his habit of tearing down the walls of the cities under his rule made it difficult for his descendants to protect what he had created. He destroyed the city walls so he could keep rebellion in check. But once again, the limited vision of the kings were not far-ranging enough to see the greater world beyond their domains. With no safe havens, the people of the empire were easily attacked by the barbarian hordes from the mountains. The mountains offered safe haven and protection to the barbarians, but the plains of Mesopotamia offered no protection without city walls. It was not just the mountain tribes who were giving Sargon's empire trouble, but the cities of Sumeria were also in constant agitation and rebellion. 1,000 years of Sumerian rule had been upset by Sargon. The Sumerians liked things as they had always been. Even though Sumerian society had its share of inequalities with the Awalim, the haves, swindling the lands and lives of the Muskanim, have-nots, at least the people could appeal to the king or to the priests for relief. In Sumeria, over and above all, were the gods, and it was to them that the people owed their ultimate allegiance. Yes, Sargon had shown his loyalty to the gods in the traditional way by rebuilding the temples. So, the people could see that their taxes and tribute were being used to serve the gods. Yet it was not the way that things had always been, because the wealth of Sumeria was being siphoned off to the empire of Sargon, while the people were ruled by Semites from the north. Semitic Amorites, who had always been regarded by the Sumerians as barbarians, nomads, and lowly paid laborers. But what was just as bad, Sargon had given the merchants and moneylenders full rights of exploitation, that is, if you were a Semite of Kish, an Akkadian. As in ancient times, merchants could travel the trade routes through the safe passage guarantees of the king to whom taxes were paid. But it was Sargon's Amorite moneylenders who had financed Sargon's empire, not the moneylenders of Sumeria. The Sumerian moneylenders and merchants were not given the same access to trade routes without a higher tax to the king. This did much to throw the Sumerian merchants behind the rebellions that were springing up in Sargon's empire. Nowhere were the Sumerian merchants more opposed to Sargon than in the city of Lagash. Lagash is where the pious king of Uruk-Hagina had freed his people from the greed of the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, so it might seem odd that the merchants of Lagash, who had helped to overthrow Uruk-Hagina, would want a return to Sumerian rule, especially since they had been guilty of overthrowing Uruk-Hagina and installing Lugal-Zagessi in his stead. But under Sargon, the Amorite moneylenders had given full authority to practice the Sumerian swindle throughout his empire, and their preferential treatment had reduced the Sumerian moneylenders' profits. What was worse for the Sumerian merchant moneylenders, Lagash had been one of the main river ports for trade coming upriver from the Persian Gulf. Once Sargon had built his capital city, this trade bypassed Lagash for the quays and warehouses of Agade, leaving the Tamkaram of Lagash without a wholesale source. Sargon lived to be an old man, but his son Ramush, on his ascension, found the empire torn by revolts and rebellions. The Sumerian people longed for those holy times when the people served the gods rather than serving the moneylenders. In bitter battles involving tens of thousands of troops, Ramush, R-I-M-U-S-H, Ramush, I'll keep saying that. It's just how I like it. Ramush reconquered the cities of Ur, Umma, Adab, Lagash, Dur, and Kazalu, as well as the countries of Elam and Barashi. To be a king meant to also be a warrior. A fragment of a vase bearing his name was found at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria, and, like his father, he claims to have held for Enlil the entire country from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, together with all of the mountains. Ramush was killed in a palace conspiracy, assassinated by certain of his courtiers, possibly even including his elder brother Manish-Tushu, who succeeded him and whose name, meaning who was with him, perhaps indicates that they were twins. Ramush reigned only 9 years, and Manish-Tushu followed him as king. Manish-Tushu, 2276 to 2261, like his father Sargon, carried his victorious armies to far distant lands, or at least so it might seem from a passage in one of his inscriptions which reads, quote, "When he, Manish-Tushu, had crossed the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, in ships, 32 kings gathered against him, but he defeated them and smote their cities and prostrated their lords and destroyed the whole countryside as far as the silver mines." Again, the ancient records name the primary goal and chief prize of these wars: silver that could be seized rather than paid for, silver that could be mined for the debts by the debt slaves and the war slaves for the cheap pay of a bowl of barley, silver that could be dug out of the mountains and given to the moneylenders to pay the interest on their loans to the king, silver to balance the phantom interest created by the Sumerian swindle. Manish-Tushu brought back black stone from the mountains beyond the sea, shipping it directly to the quays of Agade. This was almost certainly the beautifully grained diorite in which his surviving statues are carved in a naturalistic style, striking in its contrast with the stylized conventions of the early dynastic period. That Manish-Tushu held Assyria is clear from a votive inscription dedicated to him at Assur, and from a later text of King Shamshi Adad, who, while restoring the Ishtar temple at Nineveh, found a number of statues in stele recording the Akkadian king's founding of that temple. Manish-Tushu reigned 15 years and was followed by his son Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin was the grandson of Sargon. He controlled an empire from Central Asia Minor to the southern end of the Persian Gulf. Ultimately, the empire collapsed under the pressures of the peoples from the mountains of the north and east. These people were known as Gutians, Gutians, G-U-T-I-A-N-S. Gutians. This is what most archaeologists and historians will tell you, but, of course, the story goes much, much deeper than that. Beginning around 2200 BC, a great drought descended upon the entire Near East, bringing the Old Kingdom of Egypt to an end and seriously weakening Sargon's empire. Although Egyptian civilization collapsed from famine, the weakened empire of Sargon suffered from treason within and attack from without. In his own inscriptions, Naram-Sin records the military defeat of Mani of Magan, Oman, which indicates that he controlled the whole of the western coast of the Persian Gulf, at least as far as Oman. A poetic composition of some centuries later extols the magnificence of Naram-Sin's times, speaking of mighty elephants and apes, beasts from distant lands, abounding in the great square of the capital. This suggests trade relations with India. In the northeast, Naram-Sin penetrated into what are now the Kurdish hills, quelling, at least temporarily, the hill tribes then known as the Lulu, and setting up a great relief carved high in the face of the rock which still exists today, 4,000 years later. To guard the route into Asia Minor, he built a great castle at Tel Brak, and it is likely that there was another such garrison at Nineveh. A stela of his has been found as far north as Diarbeker, Diarbeker, on the borders of Armenia. All of this reflects the great wealth and power of Naram-Sin and the entire dynasty of his grandfather Sargon. And where there is great wealth, there are the moneylenders and merchants seeking to acquire as much as possible of it for themselves. These parasites can make a profit both in times of peace and in times of war. But it was during times of war that the Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, found their greatest and fastest opportunities for profits. The moneylender guilds transcended political and geographic boundaries because silver, when used as a type of money, transcended those same boundaries. But please note that silver was not a true money. As you will see in Volume 2, The Monsters of Babylon, true money would be an invention of the Greeks. Silver was a commodity money of barter which was traded in weighted amounts for other commodities, and so it was controlled like any other commodity by those who could manipulate its availability. By the time of Sargon's dynasty, the people of all cities and lands in Mesopotamia were entrapped by both the Akkadian and the Sumerian moneylenders, whose ruthless practice of the Sumerian swindle continued under Sargon, who owed them so much. However, because the Akkadians of Kish now controlled the trade routes of Sargon's empire, they were in an advantageous position to control prices for goods sold to the Sumerian merchants. Thus, being outmaneuvered and undercut, the merchants of Sumeria could only sell for the higher prices and reflected the higher taxes to the king and the higher wholesale prices that they had to pay to the Akkadian wholesalers. This led to a lot of dissatisfaction among the Sumerian merchants, since their wealth declined, and because they had always been a part of the Sumerian community, they expressed their dissatisfaction through sedition. In every city, the merchants have always been in a strategic position in every marketplace and in every shop to foment rebellion among the ordinary people. The merchants were the middlemen between farmer, palace, and temple, so they could spread dissension to all classes. As Awalim, the haves, they had the ear of the upper classes. Among themselves, the merchants could gripe about lower profits and discuss ways to improve their lot, but they could not say the same things to the rest of the people, because no one would have any sympathy at all for a moneylender or a merchant who charged the highest prices that he could get while still complaining about not. So their own self-interest. Just as in modern times, hypocrisy was a basic technique of the swindling and vicious moneylenders and merchants because that is how it has always been. Such hypocrisy and deceit worked well among the illiterate Muskanum, have-nots, who were told about how much more they had to pay for something to eat because of the increased tribute to Sargon and his sons. The Sumerian moneylenders were just as ravenous as the Akkadian moneylenders of Sargon's empire, and they practiced the Sumerian swindle to its fullest profit. But as merchants who had personal contact with the people every day, they could plead poverty with conviction. They could blame the Akkadians of the north for the increased prices because the complaint was true. Thus, Sargon found constantly rebellious cities throughout his empire, and all of his sons fared no better. They could win an empire, but to hold it required constant police action, crowd control, and warfare. Constant warfare raised prices, which added to the profits of both the Akkadian and the Sumerian Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, because only the merchants and moneylenders belonged to a guild that was devoted solely to buying and selling all things and lending at interest grain and silver. All profits increased during times of war, so the merchants and moneylenders found their greatest profits by promoting rebellion. Naram-Sin's own inscriptions mention a general rebellion of the principal cities of Sumeria and Akkad, including Kish, Uruk, and Sippar. While the tradition mentions that the goddess Inin decided to abandon the capital, Agade, the immediate cause of the withdrawal of divine favor is now known. A Sumerian text, put together from a number of fragments in various museums, describes in the opening lines the early splendor and wealth of Agade, to which people came from all quarters of the world bearing their tribute. The impious deed of Naram-Sin brought this to an end, for he had allowed his troops to desecrate, sack, and loot the Akur, the great temple of the highest god Enlil in the holiest of the Sumerian cities, Nippur. The Sumerian city of Nippur was a part of Sargon's conquests in creating the Akkadian Empire. But the carefully laid plans of the moneylenders' dream of gaining wealth and protection under Sargon was overturned by the Sumerian priests. The religions of Sumeria, all without exception, were based upon the belief that mankind was created to serve the gods. Once Sargon and his sons and grandsons gained the kingship of Sumer and replaced the Sumerian governors and kings with their own men, once the taxes and tribute and labor of the Sumerian people began to be siphoned off toward the construction and embellishment of Sargon's capital city of Agade, rather than being used toward a pious and prosperous life of the Sumerian people, And once Sargon allowed the Sumerian Swindle to again ravage the people through his Akkadian moneylenders, the priests declared the displeasure of the god Enlil and so promoted rebellion. After the rebellion was quashed, when Naram-Sin again took control of Nippur, he punished the priests of the Akur temple by allowing his troops to loot it. The importance of Nippur is reflected even today in the great size of its mud brick ziggurat mound of Enlil's temple, located between Baghdad and Basra in southern Iraq. Nippur was one of the longest-lived Sumerian sites, beginning in the prehistoric Ubaid period 5000 BC and lasting up until about 800 AD in the Islamic era. From the earliest recorded times, Nippur was a sacred city, not a political capital. It was this holy character which allowed Nippur to survive numerous wars and the fall of dynasties that brought destruction to other cities. Although not a capital city, Nippur had an important role to play in politics. Kings, on ascending the throne in cities such as Kish, Ur, and Isin, sought recognition at Akur, the temple of Enlil, the chief god of the Mesopotamian pantheon. In exchange for such legitimization, the kings lavished gifts of land, precious metals and stone, and other commodities on the temples and on the stone and on the city as a whole. At the end of successful wars, rulers would present booty, including captives, to Enlil and to the other gods at Nippur. In an effort to win the blessings of the gods and priests and peoples of Nippur, kings carried out expensive construction and restoration of the temples, public administration buildings, fortification walls, and canals. The literary tradition that later attached itself so strongly to Sargon and Naram-Sin saw them not only as two of the most illustrious figures in the ancient world, but also as rulers whose disastrous final years implied some stigma of ill fate. Sargon, following the usual public relations promotion of rebuilding Sumerian temples, had provided all of the cities of Sumeria, including Nippur's Akur temple, with renovation works and treasures for the god. All of his sons followed in this ancient Sumerian tradition, but during the Akkadian reign, Nippur was among the rebellious cities who chafed at Semitic rule. The priests of Nippur were not so foolish as to believe that the gifts of Sargon had been anything but a bribe to the gods offered by a foreign king. The Sumerian people wanted to be free of the Semites and the rapacious moneylenders who stood behind the throne. The priests of Nippur wanted to serve the gods and protect the people. My eyes are starting to burn. And the moneylenders and merchants of Sumeria wanted the wealth that was being siphoned away from them by the dynasty of Sargon. So, together the priests and the Sumerian Tamkaram, merchant moneylenders, put their wealth and prestige behind whatever anti-Akkadian alliances arose. We know from contemporary inscriptions that Naram-Sin had refurbished the Akur temple and dedicated statues there celebrating his victories. So, like his grandfather, Sargon, he had given the temple even more wealth. But when rebellion broke out, Naram-Sin did not forget his grandfather's generosity or his own gifts toward what appeared to him as an ungrateful temple of priests at Nippur. And knowing from his spies that the Sumerian moneylenders were involved in these rebellions and tribal uprisings, he decided to take the silver and gold that was helping to finance those revolutions. Naram-Sin sacked Nippur as well as the Akur temple. His ships docked at the quay by the temple in order to load and carry off the loot to Agade. Once again, the moneylenders and merchants had lost their wealth to the confiscations of a king, even though it was stored in the holiest temple of the greatest god. Pillaging a temple was not something that was usually done in Sumeria, since the armies on both sides feared all of the gods equally. Very few individuals would dare to risk the curse of a god for doing so. Sargon respected this, and his humility before the gods can be seen in his kingly titles, which were comparatively modest and reflected little more than the titulary used by the early dynastic kings. But under his grandson, Naram-Sin, a change took place so startling that it proved in the long run unacceptable. Naram-Sin could dare to pillage Nippur's temples because he considered himself a mighty king who was as strong as a god. Naram-Sin adopted a naming style that was previously the exclusive prerogative of the gods. On his own inscriptions, his name appears preceded by the determinative for divinity, that is, the cuneiform sign God, normally written before the name of a god. The language in texts dedicated to him was even less reserved, and in these his servants address him not merely as divine, but literally as God of Agade. This divine form of name was adopted by Naram-Sin's son, Shar-Kali-Shari, and the later kings of Ur and Isin. Although there is evidence to suggest a widespread cult of the divine king under the succeeding dynasty at Ur, the principle of a divine kingship was never wholeheartedly adopted in Mesopotamia. Certainly, the deified Mesopotamian king was in no way comparable with the divine and absolute pharaoh in Egypt. Even divine Mesopotamian kings, along with their people, remained at all times subject to the will of the gods. Sargon and his sons, Ramush and Manishtushu, and his grandson Naram Sin were adept at smothering rebellion. The uncoordinated uprisings scattered around the Akkadian Empire were efficiently suppressed. Remember, Sargon had torn down the walls of the Sumerian cities precisely as a preventative to such rebellion. Without safe refuge and with Akkadian troops stationed in all cities, rebellion was difficult, and the king was supported in all of his actions by his own Amorite moneylenders, priests, and merchants. But the Sumerian moneylenders not only wanted their confiscated wealth back, but they wanted the fruits of empire as well. Since the Sumerian people, who had Akkadian troops stationed around their various cities, could not raise an army strong enough to defeat the Akkadians, the moneylenders and city governors devised a plan to induce the wild tribes of the mountains to attack the Akkadians. Far up in the mountains, away from the prying eyes of Akkadian spies, through gifts, bribes, supply of bronze weapons, and promises of future wealth, the moneylenders hired an army of wild tribesmen to attack Akkad on many fronts. This would be a recurring technique throughout history. Secret fraud number 15 of the Sumerian swindle: loans to friends are power, loans to enemies are weapons. By making loans to friends at low interest rates and easy terms, the moneylenders gained the goodwill and cooperation of people who acquiesce to becoming their friends and buying their goods. The profits are low, but the power is great. By making loans to enemies, regardless of the loan rates, the moneylenders give enemies strength. In this case, the Sumerian moneylenders gave gifts as well as loans of silver, grain, and weapons to the Gutian tribes, and encouraged them to attack and loot the cities of Akkad. To hide the Sumerian sources of Gutian, I'll just call it that, Gutian financial backing, the moneylenders blamed the god Enlil for bringing the attacks upon the Akkadians. According to the priests at Nippur, it was their furious god Enlil who brought down from the hills upon the fertile land the barbarous race of Gutians. These savages disrupted communications and trade, upset and ruined the irrigation system, which always required careful, constant, and centralized control, and produced famine and death throughout the land. To turn aside Enlil's wrath from Sumeria and Akkad as a whole, 8 of the senior gods undertook that Agade itself should itself be destroyed in reprisal for the violation of Nippur. It has been plausibly argued that, in fact, the Gutians were neither the sole nor the deciding factor in the downfall of the Agade dynasty. There is no indication in the Akkadian inscriptions that the Gutians were recognized as a menace sufficiently serious to disrupt this situation, and this can hardly be due to deliberate suppression of the truth, since conflict with rebellious city-states is freely mentioned. But the Akkadian inscriptions could only recognize overt threats of actual rebellions, not covert threats of secret alliances and subversive activity. Because the Sumerians did not have walled cities as strongholds, and with Sargon and his sons stationing troops throughout Sumeria, it was not possible for the Sumerian people to free themselves from foreign domination without outside help. This help came from the secret alliances with the mountain tribes of Gutia, and these alliances could only have been arranged... Man, let me look that up. There's no way I'm getting that right. So there's a Gutia, Bangladesh. Gutian people. Oh, it's Gutty. Or Cutty, also known by the derived exonyms Gutians or Gutians, different spelling, were a nomadic people of West Asia around the Zagros Mountains, modern Iraq, during ancient times. Okay. So it's Gutty or Cuddy? It's spelled with a Q either way. So I'll say Gutty. tribes of Gudea, and these alliances could only have been arranged by the merchants and the envoys of the Sumerian leaders who traveled in disguise with the merchant caravans. Rebellion is not something that occurs overnight, but requires years of planning if it is to be successful. Secrecy requires patience, and the Sumerian moneylenders understood both secrecy and patience as well as the horrible penalty of discovery. According to the cuneiform tablets, with the increasing rebellions within the cities and the increasing attacks from the mountain tribes, Naram Sin's son, Shar Kali Shari, appears to have tried to undo some of the mischief wrought by his father. Several of his dedicatory inscriptions, in which he describes himself as the builder of the Akur, the house of Enlil, show his panic-stricken piety as he attempted to appease the god of Naram Sin's looting and transgressions. But appeasing the angry god did not help in the least to appease the conniving moneylenders and merchants of Lagash, Nippur, and all of Sumeria. With famine and desolation rampant, so the tablets continue, 8 of the major gods decide that for the good of mankind, Enlil's rage must be assuaged. Assuaged. Oh my god. Assuaged. No, so I got it. They vow to Enlil the total destruction of Agade and pronounce upon that city a lengthy curse. Quote, "May your groves be heaped up like dust. May your clay bricks return to the depths of the earth. May your palace built with joyful heart be turned into a depressing ruin. Over the place where your rites and rituals were conducted, may the fox who haunts the ruined mounds glide his tail. May no human being walk because of snakes, vermin, and scorpions." And concludes the poet-historian who wrote of the fall of the Akkadian Empire, such indeed was the case. Thereafter, Agade remained desolate and uninhabited. The site of Agade remains unidentified today, though it is almost certainly to be found in the vicinity of Kish or Babylon. Indeed, it is possible that the city was situated somewhere within the later city boundaries of Babylon itself, or even buried today in the ancient dust beneath streets and buildings of modern Baghdad. No one knows. And that concludes that subchapter in this recording.